Hello, hi. Sorry for a slight delay because we think people are just sort of being late and the weather is so wonderful. But thank you to everyone who managed to get here. And I'm Elena Sudakova, I'm director of Pushkin House. And it gives me a great pleasure to welcome tonight Donald Rayfield, whose book, A Seditious and Sinister Tribe, has been shortlisted for the Pushkin House Book Prize, and tonight is actually the last of the series of events dedicated to the shortlisted books. Donald will be in conversation with Ekaterina Schulmann. Now, for apparently the purposes of introduction, Ekaterina has requested Donald's CV, which arrived as a 10-page document. And I'm not exactly sure what she had in mind, whether she wanted me to read it out to you or whether she wants to read it herself. But I think Donald, I won't do that, but Donald really hardly requires an introduction. He's a distinguished linguist, literary scholar, historian, and the author of numerous influential works, including Stalin and His Hangman, a biography of Anton Chekhov, and The Age of Empires, A History of Georgia. He has also translated a wide range of Georgian, Russian, and Uzbek literature. Ekaterina Schulmann also hardly requires an introduction. She's a leading Russian political scientist, the author and co-host of her own, I've wrote that down and now it has disappeared. So the author and co-host of her own show, Status, also a co-host of a literary program called The Bookmark, and a cultural erudite, and a trustee of Pushkin House. So Ekaterina, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight. The CV that has been mentioned by Yelena was indeed one of the most impressive I've ever read. It consisted of two parts. The first was very short and it listed, again, an intimidating number of honors and academic titles of Professor Rayfield, and then in the usual sections of working experience, academic affiliations and conferences, it says, well, many things, this and that, across the continents, and here comes the second part. And the second part was 10 pages long, and that was the list of publications. So I said that I do hope to reach something of that kind when I grow up, but the hope is really, I would say, shady. So, to begin with, as I suspect many people in this audience, I am primarily acquainted with Professor Rayfield's work as a biographer of Chekhov, as an author of a monumental and I would say disturbing biography of our national writer. I've read it. It's a sizable work. It, I would say, artfully avoids any literary criticism of Chekhov's output, but it lists in meticulous detail, well, meticulous and sometimes, how would I put it? I said disturbing, I can't say disgusting, but yes, troublesome detail, the personal and professional life of Chekhov and his family. I was not aware that he was so socially and sexually active throughout his comparatively short lifespan. So, what I want to ask is this. When one reads this list of publications, the thing that strikes one is the immense diversity of the subject. So, how come the biographer of Chekhov and the translator of Leskov to write a book on an enticing subject of Stalin and his hangman, and then a history of Georgia, and then a history of Crimean Tatars?
Yes, I think a psychiatrist could probably sort that out. It tends to be sort of casual connections, and the fact is, when I get bored with one thing, or I've done enough of one thing, I try to turn to something completely different. In the case of Chekhov, which was the first book which a publisher made any money out of, and actually took me to dinner as a result, he said, all right, your next book must be about a similar author with an interesting sexual life, and how about Strindberg? And I looked at Strindberg and I saw there are 55 volumes in Swedish, and I thought, do I really want to learn Swedish? And what I could read in English, this seemed to be the most unpleasant man I'd ever come across. And I told my agent that I'd rather spend an evening in a train with Lavrenti Beria than with Strindberg. And he said, what a good idea. And this still haunts me, because I then did Stalin and his hangmen, of whom Beria was the last. And they keep on pressing me, why don't you write a proper biography of Beria? And apart from the fact that Beria is so unpleasant in many ways, also we don't know the truth about Beria. Khrushchev burnt 11 sacks of documents. The Georgians burnt his school records when they invaded Sukhumi. And the KGB issued protocols of his interrogation, but they look very artificial. The only material I've come across that's reliable about Beria is one junior judge who was a Georgian sorted out his diary and published it in Georgian, and it was quite a convincing portrayal of a rather boring trial, which Beria knew what was going to happen, and he said the absolute minimum, behaved himself quite well. And the other thing is, every time you looked at anything to do with Beria, it turned out not to be true. Oh, the very worst things are true. He certainly murdered in large numbers, and physically too, but so I don't want to do that, and I've been avoiding it. And I come back to Chekhov simply because there's a constant trickle of information. And I keep on thinking, I thought in 1997, I'd done it, finished, goodbye. I'll leave you in peace. And then new information comes, and you have to change a lot.
Another Three Sisters?
No, unfortunately, nothing of great literary value. We know everything is written that's good is available.
Because I was surprised when reading his biography how often a real family of three sisters crops up among the circle of his acquaintance, and he and his brothers kind of have relations.
If there are three brothers, they tend to, it's like Hollywood films, they find three sisters. Yes, it's like sort of common, very convenient sort of arrangement. And I think the Bronte sisters actually inspired him. He knew about the Bronte sisters. He'd read a book about them.
Did he?
Yes. A Russian book, a biography of the Bronte sisters, cribbed from Mrs. Gaskell, but he knew the story, and it's very similar to the ne'er-do-well brother.
A family struck in the middle of nowhere who want to get to the capital. Oh my God.
Yes, yes. In fact, it hasn't stopped now, because at the very moment in Germany, I've got a firm examining DNA on an exercise book belonging to a Serbian doctor who we have reason to suppose may well be the daughter of Chekhov. Tatiana Korsh, the granddaughter of the theatre manager, whose father was never revealed, and whose mother only said that, oh yes, Chekhov and Bunin both showed interest in me, but I wasn't interested. And when asked who was the father, Tatiana said, he turned out to be нехороший человек.
Which kind of suits both of them?
Sorry?
This characteristic would suit both of them.
Well,
both Chekhov and Bunin.
Well, no, the Tatiana is his daughter. She was born in 1901. And there was a window of opportunity in which she could have been conceived, but we don't know. So these things never leave one alone. And as for Crimean Tatars, that goes back to, I think, when I first took students to Russia, and there was a certain dissident movement already moving, and there was a General Grigorienko from Simferopol, who was a war hero, and the KGB didn't want to touch him, really, but he started defending the Crimean Tatars, which was a subject that nobody in Russia was allowed to talk about. The only hint you got about it was in the 5-volume Languages of the USSR, and it began on the Crimean Tatar language is spoken in Uzbekistan, with no explanation of how that happened. And I got very interested, but and there were certain articles on Stalin's deportations, but nobody had a lot of information until the 1990s. And once that information came through, it's absolutely overwhelming. And the trouble for Crimean Tatar is that you had to learn the language. And I've always fiddled most of my life with Turkish. My son speaks very good Turkish. I have a Turkish-speaking daughter-in-law and grandchildren, but my own Turkish is sort of rough. But anyway, I've managed, with the help of a lot of dictionaries and bothering people. And the Crimean Tatars, when they got back to Crimea, they not only built lots of houses and got to work, but the cultural effort was enormous. The amount of stuff they put online before Putin took over is just unbelievable. And there's material from sympathetic Russians. There's a man called Vazgrin who died recently. He was expelled from the academy and ostracized for doing this. He wrote a 4-volume history of the Crimean Tatars, which I plundered, of course. I thought this was a remarkable people. Not always very nice to know,
and not very popular with their neighbors, I've heard.
Well, yes, they made 2 mistakes, Crimean Tatars. The one mistake is the sort of thing that the Duke of Westminster makes. That's just you are a big freeholder and you treat your leaseholders very badly. And so they kept on writing letters to the King of Poland, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, the Tsar of Russia, reminding him that his lands actually belonged to Genghis Khan, and the Crimean Tatars were the only heirs left of Genghis Khan, and would he kindly pay up the lease to be renewed. And sometimes these letters were backed up by reminders that if you don't pay your lease, we will come and we will take, we'll bring 100,000 men, each one will capture 1 citizen to enslave and take 1 head of cattle away, and that will cost you far more than paying the lease. And until 1700 they paid up, which is enormous. But he did depopulate the south of Poland. They did depopulate Poland, and they became extremely unpopular. And there are serious plans, if you read the book, you'll find in Poland and in Russia, to exterminate the Crimean Tatars, which you might say Putin is finally achieving, or has tried to achieve. So they didn't calculate on maintaining a reputation. You can enslave and you can depopulate, but you have to know the limit. And this Naimiero, they didn't. But they were very clever in some ways, the way in which they manipulated between Poland and Russia, always supporting the weaker side against the stronger, and then switching when necessary. Alliances with Cossacks, which is now the last alliance they have, the Ukrainian alliance. So it was a highly intelligent people. They were very cultured, and their culture, unfortunately, was destroyed by Russia with the burning of all their books, the burning of all their manuscripts, and so on. So it's a tragic story, and you feel, well, they asked for it. There was a book by, was it Norman Davies, called Forgotten Kingdoms, pointed out how many kingdoms we've forgotten about. He didn't include the Crimean Tatars.
That's being forgotten indeed.
Utterly forgotten, yes. Nobody's quite sure whether they were a kingdom or whether they were just a department of the Ottoman Empire. But they did have embassies in countries that the Ottoman Empire didn't have embassies. They did fight wars that the Ottoman Empire didn't fight, and they refused to fight in wars which the Ottoman Empire did fight. They didn't like fighting Iran. They rather admired Iran and Shia Islam and Sufis. So they were semi-independent. I say you could compare them to Australia as a dominion in the British Empire. Sometimes it joins in, sometimes it doesn't. But it is a history, and I suppose it is a history that's probably being completed, which is unusual.
Was your interest in this region somehow connected with your studying Stalinism and Stalin's deportations of people, including Crimean Tatars? So if we connect the dots of your reading list, so did Crimean Tatars somehow stem from your interest in Stalin and Beria?
Yes, partly. It was already part of that. I was already interested, but I just didn't have the material to make and the background to do it. And that came later, in the 1990s, really, when the enormous flood of information. It took years to digest. It took a long time to write this book, actually.
Yeah, given the time frame, which is quite a factor here, when was the last time you were able to visit Crimea?
Ah, a long time ago, yes. Yes, it's almost like a antiquity, since it's distance politically and it makes
so
it...
how long time ago? I understand it must be before 2014.
Oh, well before that, yes. I think perhaps the last time just in this century, but I don't remember exactly. Yes.
It's in this century, that's something.
But then people write histories of ancient Greece, but...
Yes, but they're able to visit Greece, although not ancient Greece per se. So
yes.
How does a historian work with a subject which is so toxic politically? You say this book took a long time to write, but you published it last year.
Yes.
So presumably you were writing it after 2014 and perhaps even after 2022.
Yes, certainly.
After that time, after that period, where do you get your material? You can't visit archives, you can't talk to people, you can't get help from Russian historians or Ukrainian historians either?
You can get material from Ukraine. There's quite a lot of... that is now the center of Tatar culture. Most members of the Mejlis are in Kiev. Those that are in the Crimea are either under arrest or keeping very, very quiet. So I would say there's nothing happening, basically, in Crimean Tatar culture, nothing that I know of. I'm in touch with a number of Crimean Tatars, and they're just hanging on, and they're working for a Ukrainian victory, they hope, because that they see as the only hope of any continuation.
And that's exactly what the Russian government suspects. That's why it tries to, as you gently put it, exterminate this population.
Yes. It's a more common policy in Russian history than I think people admit. I mean, the whole of the Black Sea, the eastern coast of where are the Ubykh, the last Ubykh, all deported to Anatolia where they died out, every one of them. Half the Circassians, half the Abkhaz. There's been a massive depopulation of indigenous people. It's as bad as anything in the British Empire, in fact.
They tried to do it with the Chechens, whom they called Cherkesy at that time.
Yes.
I think there is a term in history, Genocide Cherkesov, but they didn't completely succeed.
Yes.
In this particular endeavor.
Yes. Yes. It's not a subject I want to continue writing about.
Well, I think after your close acquaintance with Lavrenti Beria, it's difficult to scare you.
Yes, and apart from the fact that some of the languages you would have to learn are languages that it takes a lifetime to learn. So there.
So given the political toxicity and the sudden historical actuality of your subject, a question which kind of came to my mind, though perhaps it's not the question that ought to be addressed to you. We have this book on a shortlist for Pushkin House Book Prize, which is, by definition, a prize for the best non-fiction book in English about Russia. How do you feel as an author? Does your book, does your subject belong to this category?
Yes, that's a big question. Part of it's about Russia, yes. I would say Russia enters the scene in the second half of the book and dominates more and more. Russia, it doesn't even exist in the first half of the book. It's the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, which at one point was quite friendly to the Crimeans. They collaborated in fighting the old Golden Horde and the rest of the Mongols, up to Vasily III and Ivan III. Relations were not all that bad. It's just when Ivan the Terrible decided he would eat up the last Tatar Khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, and Crimea was more than he could bite off. He couldn't even chew it. But later, Peter the Great managed to begin the process. So yes, it is partly about Russia. Whether it's predominantly about Russia and should therefore be excluded from the prizes, I don't know, but I leave that to you.
It's rather too late in the day to make decisions, although the jury may decide whatever it thinks fit. But so the book is constructed chronologically. You tell a story, right? And the second half of the story is mostly about your people, your subjects' relations with Russia. And you end in today, in the situation we are today. So if you were supposedly to write a continuation, what in all probability that continuation would be? How do you see the future of these people?
I can see that they would be like other Turkic groups in Ukraine and Russia, small minorities of very local interest, unable to exert any political influence. One of the striking things about the Crimean Tatars is that the Turks themselves are very sort of cool. When a number of Crimean Tatars from the Red Army were captured by the Germans and enrolled in a Turkestani legion, they were stranded in Germany, and the Allied forces decided to send them back to Russia, where they were going to be shot or go to the Gulag, and they appealed to Turkey, and Turkey refused them visas unless they had a close relative already living in Turkey, and these are virtually fellow Turks. And since then, Turkey has never made any loud noises about what's happened in Crimea. It's intervened, I think, and saved 3 or 4 prominent people. And a man I discovered, stupidly after I'd finished the book, an interesting Crimean Tatar novelist who has written a number of, I think, rather good autobiographical novels. He was in the Red Army. He was captured by the Germans, enrolled in the Turkestani Legion, and then he had the good fortune to marry a Polish girl. And when the British started rounding them up to deport, he explained he was a Turk from Cyprus, therefore a Commonwealth citizen, and married to a Polish girl, and they had a baby, so he was allowed into Britain. He lived for 60 years in Dalston, working by day in a little Turkish restaurant and writing all night in Turkish, a language he didn't really know. It's rather like a Norwegian deciding to write novels in Danish. It requires quite a lot of adjustment, I would have thought. And he became quite famous in Turkey. He's still in print. And when he died in 2011, the Turkish foreign minister arranged for him to be exhumed from Wimbledon and flown out to Crimea and buried in his native village, just in time before the Russian takeover. So that is, I think, the one acknowledgement by Turkey of the Turkish Empire. In fact, my title, which
yes, that was my next question. Where did you get this from?
Highly offensive, but on the other hand, it does attract attention. If you write just another history of the Crimean Tatars, it might sit in the books, but that's so offensive that it makes people sit up. That was words of a very senior Turkish diplomat when the Turks were losing a war with Russia.
Which one? There were so many.
There are many wars, but this is 1774.
And they all answer to this description.
The one that ended with the Treaty of Küçük Kaynaca. And Catherine was absolutely overjoyed because
Derzhavin wrote an ode.
Russia got recognition as protector of Christians in the Balkans, and Catherine, who was one of the greatest hypocrites ever in politics, said that
that's a professional qualification.
Very, very, very. She and Voltaire together are a horrible pair if you read their correspondence.
And he has less excuse
Yes.
because he was not ruling over anything.
Yes. Well, anyway,
So I defended our national pride, right, didn't I?
they agreed that the Tatars should be totally independent, not to be interfered with either by Turkey or by Russia, and they would be forgiven all their offences because they didn't attack Russia of their own free will, it was all a misunderstanding. And some of the Tatars fell for this, some of them thought that actually we might be better off. There's always been a problem in Russia with the Kazan Tatars, whom Ivan the Terrible treated terribly, but after he treated them terribly...
Hence the popular Russian expression Kazanskaya sirota, the
yes.
orphan of Kazan, which kind of speaks volumes.
Well, there's a number of expressions about Tatars, but... Nezvani gość huczy Tatarina.
Yes, there are even less decent ones, which we won't quote in this highly academic conversation.
Uninvited guest is worse than a Tatar, and when there are protests, they altered this to an uninvited guest is better than a Tatar.
Better than a Tartar, yes. That's an excellent.
But also in the Kazan Tatars have been used like bellwethers. You know this goat or sheep they keep in a slaughterhouse, which is thoroughly tame, and when other sheep and goats come to be slaughtered, they introduce the bellwether, and the bellwether tells the sheep, oh, it's fine here, follow me, you'll be okay. And the Kazan Tatars have always been used with the Bashkirs and the Crimean Tatars to persuade them that Russia is very fond of its Muslims because they have so many children, and therefore don't be afraid of being a citizen of Russia. So that 1774 treaty and the point is that the senior Ottoman diplomat who negotiated this treaty, Ahmed Resmi, in his memoirs wrote that he was so glad to get rid of the Tatars that they'd cost the Ottoman Empire everything because they kept on getting the Ottoman Empire involved in wars with Russia that they didn't want. They were so fond of coffee and opium and silver that they emptied the treasury, they had become lazy and addicted, and the Russians were welcome to them. So, and he said they were a seditious and sinister tribe. And the sad thing about the Tatars, they were under one particular dynasty family, the Girais, and they could have ruled the Ottoman Empire. There appears to have been an agreement. It's been confirmed by, there's no document that exists, but it's been confirmed in the 14th century and the 17th century that if the Ottoman dynasty ever died out, then the Tatars, as descendants of Genghis Khan, would become the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. And there was a moment at which this nearly happened when one of the most ill-tempered of sultans, Murad IV, died. He was a terribly ill-tempered man. He used to go around coffee houses and round up all the people drinking coffee, which he didn't like and forbade, and have them executed. And he got rid of all his brothers except one mentally deranged one. And on his deathbed, he ordered his last brother to be executed, so there'd be no heir. He also ordered all his doctors to be executed. But the viziers thought...
Nice old man he must have been.
Yes, well, his doctors thought, well, he's never going to get out of bed, so let's not bother. But had that order been carried out, then the Crimean Tatars would have ruled the Balkans, and our history, yours, mine, everybody's, might have been very different.
So, I have a sudden realization. The Sultan described in Bakhchisarayski Fontan, the fountain of Bakhchisaray, Pushkin's Giray Khan, he's a Crimean Tatar?
Yes, that's a fantasy.
I know the story didn't happen. So there were no two beauties,
No, I think he's describing one of the last Khans, and it might have been one of the more civilized ones, Kirim Giray, who was very interested in French literature and all sorts of things, and tended to fall in love with a lot of his concubines. But this idea of, there's a lot of fiction in the love stories associated with the harems. Actually, the Tatars weren't as interested in women as the Ottomans. You could say that the Ottomans had one philosophy, like the Tatars, really, you could be somewhat make war, not love. Their national song was, I love my horse more than any So I don't think that Pushkin's fantasy was reflected any reality. It was a tale told to the first Russian tourists once the Crimea had been assimilated. But
technically, it is about Crimean Tatars because that's where the action takes place.
Yes, it is. It's about Bakhchisaray's palace, which still exists, some of it, was then conceived in romantic terms. It was sort of Moorish architecture and so on. And the idea of all these Georgian and Polish women locked up, some unhappy, some jealous, some very happy, and the intrigues and the tears, the suicide and so on. But it's a sort of Byronic tale, fantasy.
Oriental, yes, Oriental fantasy. I see you have artfully avoided answering the question about the future of your subject by taking me aside to the vices of Ottoman Empire rulers, but still, coming back to
Yes.
the issue at hand, you said that your best guess for the Crimean Tatars is that, like other Turkish tribes, they will be what? And then you said that Turkey is not really interested in them. So
Yes.
what's
well, I would say in Ukraine,
the
there are other Turkic peoples, the Gagals in Moldavia and in Ukraine, and they have a few villages and so on. A certain degree of people leave them in peace, but they have no political influence. They don't have any connections with the pan-Turkic movement. I think even in Lithuania there's a small Gagauz group too. So there are remnants of Turks, a little like sort of, in some ways, the Celts in some parts of the world.
So you don't believe they will take back Crimea in any foreseeable future?
Well, it'll be the future one would like to foresee will be at least it'll be Ukrainian with tolerance for Tatars, but the way things are going, I don't even think that is. I think that is looking at the world through very, very tinted spectacles.
I have one other question that perhaps is hardly a question to address to a scholar, but still, you've been writing about the history of this peninsula of Crimea.
Yes.
Don't you feel that the place is cursed?
That it's?
It's cursed. It's so drenched with blood at every period of its history. Don't you feel there's something wrong with it? Pretty as the landscape is.
Yes, I suppose I suppose there are South American countries that could be a paradise and are not, that have the perfect climate and have lots. Yes, it may be desired by so many people. And if you go back over history, there are periods of 50, 60 years when things are peaceful.
Like when?
6th century was pretty good, I would say. Yes, when the Byzantines had settled things, there were people who flourished there. The Goths, for instance, had their most peaceful existence. The Ostrogoths settled in Crimea, and they became literate and Christian and good farmers. And there's still lots of Gothic words in the Crimean Tatar language. Fair-haired men are called Gottfrieder. Yes, cellars are called Keller. Gothic was probably spoken until the 17th century in some of the mountains.
Amazing.
Yes, so some people survived and were left in peace. And you look at medieval Russia, and it's very hard to pick a period in which you could have lived without the threat of being murdered or taxed to death or worked to death in the fields.
So you don't include the high days of Romanov's empire into your list of peaceful periods?
No, I suppose not.
When you know there was the Palace of Livadia and all that, at least there was no immediate bloodshed in the area. See, I'm trying to advertise Romanovs to you.
Yes, I suppose we've been exceptionally lucky in Britain in the last how many years since the war? That's nearly 80 years of no bombs. well, except the odd terrorist one, but no serious disturbance. It's very unusual in history if you look back.
So studying history makes you, I would say, tolerant.
Makes you grateful for, yes, being born after Hitler and hoping to depart shortly before Putin.
Yes, but yeah, right now is not a comfortable period either. Neither for your specific subject nor for any other.
Yes. No, that's, yes, we should change the subject. This is too depressing.
Yes, that's becoming too depressing. I do have a couple of questions, not directly related to the book, but related to your other work, and then we can turn to the audience for the Q&A part. You have written about Chekhov and you have translated Chekhov. I always thought that he's a writer to appeal specifically to English people, to English audience. He's somehow relevant, even in his biography, a doctor with an interest in gardening and some social activity who is doing the writing in this very understated tone with no pathos. I think he could have been an English writer.
You're quite right. I mean, he appeals to the British. I mean, it took some time for him between the first publications and before. It took 50 years before he became popular. But I think there are certain factors. First of all, he doesn't really tell people what to think. You can make up your own mind. Stories tend not to have ends.
No beginnings.
I think, well, you don't need a beginning, you can guess. And Chekhov characters, when you meet them, it's like meeting a real person, because when you meet a real person, they don't hand you a little card with their entire biography, as a novelist does. And he was a gardener, too, which is also reassuring to... He was quite a good gardener, actually.
Oh, yes, he planted orchards.
Yes. And his stories are a little like constructed like gardens, that you walk in the entrance and you go round, and when you come out, it's exit through the gift shop. Yes, you come out where you came in.
And he's one of a numerous family. He's both an urban dweller and a lover of the countryside. So yes, he could have been an English author. But he also translated Leskov.
Yes.
Who was a piece of cake?
No, Leskov is not a piece of cake. Leskov
and as an author.
No, Leskov I admired. I think when I started learning Russian, he was the first Russian writer I tried to read, which is very stupid. It's like a learner driver getting into a Porsche.
I would
yes.
say.
And I remembered I was in a tourist bus run by Progressive Tours, and it stopped in Minsk. And I wanted to buy Leskov, and they had Leskov only in an edition for subscribers, 11 volumes. But it was a very nice man in the thing, and I said, I really don't want volume 4. It's because it's got Zapечатный ангел, it's got Очаровный странник, it's got what I want. And he let me have it. That's Minsk for you. I shall always remember it with great gratitude. And it struck me at the time it's untranslatable. But
yes, I would say he's untranslatable.
Yeah, it's amazing what is finally translated. I won't refer to myself, but I was thinking Evgeny Onegin was always considered to be untranslatable. Nabokov translated it in order to prove it was untranslatable, because you can't read his translation. But the late Stanley Mitchell...
You can read the commentary.
The late Stanley Mitchell produced a version which, if you looked at it, you would have thought, my God, this is a new Byron poem I never knew about. It's absolutely extraordinary. With Leskov, I've translated a number of Russian classics, and most of them have been translated before, and each time you do it, you have the little satisfaction of finding something that the previous translators got wrong. And if you remember in the Enchanted Wanderer, there was a gypsy girl who sings beautifully, and it says she... Grusha, and she had a malinowy голос, or malinowy. And translators struggle with this soft fruit voice.
Did you say raspberry
voice? And then it suddenly came, there was a town in Belgium called Malines, and it has beautiful little cathedral bells. Yeah, bells, yes. And that's not even in the footnotes in the academic edition. And when something's not explained in the footnotes, it means they had no idea what it was. So I was very pleased with that.
So how did you translate that?
As like the bells of Malines. This has happened to me with Turgenev, with Fathers and Sons. Well, I didn't do it. It was the last. Turgenev's Fathers and Sons has been translated into English, I think, 13 times. And the same mistake has been made again and again. Bazarov's, the hero's father, is a doctor, country doctor, and he treats the peasants with bilyamnaya maz. And all the English translation says white ointment, which makes him a very boring doctor. Actually, bilyamnaya maz is henbane ointment. He's a very daring doctor. Half his patients must have been paralyzed after that. But they just made that mistake. It's quite good. I've made the thing about translation, you make mistakes. I switch this off, actually. It's all right, it's on. The thing about transit is when you make mistakes, they're never forgotten and never forgiven and never expunged.
They're out there in black and white.
Yes. I've had several unfortunate experiences, one of which I was caught. The one was Volosatly Babo Ingushe, Terentiev. I thought, well, hairy women of the English, I don't know many English, and I didn't know this fact.
The women can be as hairy as anybody else's women.
Later on, but English are often red-headed, and apparently it's a dish of grated carrot. So if you're offered that, you know what you're getting. And the other was, I noticed really in my biography of Chekhov, and I picked it up at the last moment and corrected it in the last edition. Fortunately, nobody picked it up. Мне ставили свечи, which was, I thought was, my friends thought I was so ill that they went to church and lit a candle for me. But no, it's suppositories. Which makes much more sense.
Considering the context, yes.
Yes, context. And it suddenly dawned on me. And I didn't apologize to anyone, but it just shows that and yet novelists can make terrible mistakes. I mean, Anna Karenina appears to be pregnant with 27 months.
Yes, that is a well-known fact, yeah.
Yes.
And Tolstoy also mixes up his seasons quite a bit.
Yes, and Dostoevsky's characters change patronyms halfway through.
And they never sleep.
Yes.
Never, ever. For like a week.
No, Chekhov was very precise.
And they don't eat either. Yes, yeah. Chekhov didn't make that kind of mistake, but he contained himself to shorter stories. Yeah. He tried to write something novel-like, because in his period, the sign of a serious real writer was a novel, and he wanted to write a novel, but his talent was completely differently constituted. So when he tried his hand on a longer fiction, it didn't come out well at all. Steppe is supposed to be good, but it's hard to read from beginning to end. Yeah. It has no plot.
Yes.
So, coming back to Leskov and your passion for unpleasant people, he was one of the unpleasantest persons in the history of Russian literature.
Yes, he beat his wives, he beat his children, he was absolutely horrible. When
he was a rotten friend, he loved scandal, public scandal, he changed his political position time and again. Yeah. So he satirized his best friends in his novels under very thin aliases, so he was as bad as bad can be. And you translated Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk and Запечатленный ангел, and what else? What other stories did you translate?
I didn't do that. I did some of the things that people don't usually do. The Unmercenary Engineers, which is actually basically a true story about someone who insists on not being corrupt.
He worked in an English firm.
But that was, and then one of his Byzantine stories, The Innocent Prudentius, which is a beautiful pastiche of a Byzantine story.
It is a stylization.
Yes. It's not a great work of literature, but
something along the lines of what Flaubert tried to do in his ancient Roman stories. Well,
yes. Now, I admit Leskov is a repugnant personality, but if you only read novels by nice people, you would be very bored.
Who are the nice people in Russian literature? That's a good question. Turgenev was harmless.
Yes, I think if you'd asked his daughter, she might have got a different answer.
The non-recognized one. Well, yes, but that's kind of minor compared. He cared for her.
Oh, he's compared. No,
he cared for her in his way. Dostoevsky was a scoundrel. There can be no two opinions about that. As a person, as a public persona, he had no shame. Lev Tolstoy was, yes, a gigantic figure, but a nightmare to live with.
Yes, you can go through it. Yes, my favorite poets, Tyutchev and Fiat, they were not nice people. But it's the wrong approach to literature to go through the personality of the author.
But then Tyutchev got beautiful women to live with him.
Sorry?
He got very lovely women to marry him and live with him.
Yes.
Even without marriage, which says a lot about him as a person.
Well,
both his wives, his German wives, were beauties.
Yes.
And then came this poor Denisova girl.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm afraid this conversation is going the wrong way.
Yes. Yes. Well, can I divert it in another direction? I'll tell you what has given me most pleasure in writing more than anything else. I mean, nobody writes for money unless they're very, very lucky. Or they have a special talent. Most pleasure I got from doing the Georgian-English dictionary. Because, first of all, someone else paid for it, a research council, and it was at a time when people in Tbilisi were virtually starving, and I managed to feed quite a lot of people with the money for it. And dictionary writing is sort of therapeutic. I recommend it. It doesn't require great intellectual effort. It's a little like knitting. Knitting pattern, you follow the pattern, you collect everything, and you are amazed at what you find. So we found that Georgian had at least 144,000 words that needed to go into a dictionary, 3.5 kilos, and we had fun finding things out. It's a language with a lot of dialects. It's a language, some dialects the Soviets refused to allow to be talked about, Jewish Georgian, for instance. And there was one particular form of speech which was very difficult for a male team to find out about. That was what women say to other women when no men are present.
The special
yeah, the special verbs. Yeah, I won't go into a mixed audience, but anyway, we finally found one Georgian woman who married to a Texan for 10 years. And she'd lost some of her principles and inhibitions, but that was very. And I had a very, very good assistant, young assistant, who now works for Conciliation Resources, who was not frightened of going anywhere. He went to prisons, he went to where the drug users hung out. He went and talked to policemen and got the slang of all sorts of things.
So you enter into a criminal den saying, "Hello, I'm composing a dictionary of Georgian language. Could you please help me with some of the terminology you're using?"
No, I think you had to go and buy something first. No, this was quite. And the only thing, my colleagues were my age, and some of them said, "This word does not exist. You must have been misinformed." And I would say, "You should ask your grandson." So that was very, very enjoyable, seeing all that word and realizing you were doing what Dr. Johnson had done. Dr. Johnson, of course, did it without a computer. And how you do it without a computer. We also had a computer expert who scanned everything, which language hadn't been scanned before. And he had electronic versions of the entire Georgian press and from the widows of novelists. So we had an enormous corpus, and we could tell if a word was not already in the dictionary. There is a magnificent 8-volume dictionary, but it was supervised by Stalin personally. And he took a great interest in it. There's a copy in his library with his
You are
comments.
certainly a person to go into details.
Well, the point is the dictionary compilers were very careful not to include anything that might annoy him. And every word had to have an example from a well-known writer, if possible. And the problem with the well-known writer was you weren't sure whether, if they were alive, whether they were going to be arrested or shot. And there's no way of getting a guarantee. And if they were arrested or shot, you then had to tear that page out and start all over again.
Yeah, dead authors are much safer.
Well, on the other hand, it isn't the contemporary language. But anyway, we went beyond that. And it's now finally sold out and it's online. So, and I keep on revising and updating it because you see how the language changes and the incredible versatility of the Georgians in adapting English. They have a verb form called dasinuli. Dasinuli means you've been gaslit, you've been seen. It means when you send a message on your phone to someone and the message is marked as seen, but you don't get a reply. So you're a person who's seen but ignored. And it's become a mantra about Georgia being a country that is dasinuli. So I'll have to update it again after another year or two when English...
My children in this situation, they say, "Меня гостят," which is I'm being ghosted.
Yeah, yes. Oh, so Russian is also...
read but not replied to.
Yes, Russian, of course, is just as influenced by English, sometimes without being aware of it. So dictionary work it doesn't require...
So that's your recipe for the times of troubles. Compose a dictionary.
Yes, yes.
Take a language you are familiar with and write a dictionary.
Well, Dr. Johnson attributed his recovery from depression to 6 years' work.
Was he depressed?
Very, very severe. Yes, very severe.
What was the reason?
Just hereditary, I think. We had a lot to be...
He seems to have been a rather bad-tempered person in the first place.
He could be rather rude, yes, but no. Yes, he didn't mince words. But no, it was an example of therapeutic writing. I recommend it.
So, I think we now should turn to our much suffering and very patient audience. Yes, and they also deserve a microphone so that they can ask questions.
Thank you so much. Donald, when Ekaterina Mikhailovna mentioned your vast publication list, I remembered my days of volunteering in Charles Dickens Museum. And I remember I would point to visitors, that's the chair where Dickens would sit, and that's captain chair, I think it's called. And then he would be writing during these hours, and that's the setting. So that was very particular. If I may, 2 questions. Yes. Do you describe yourself more as a writer or as a historian? And the second, what's your researching or writing setting? Where do you see it? Or what do you work with? Like, how does it look? What kind of hours do you work?
Do you have to wake up early?
No, I don't. I'm irregular, and since the computers appeared, I tend to write and think, well, this will always be corrected later. And earlier, when I had an electric typewriter, I used to think, I'll think first and then I'll write, because if I make a mistake, I've got to tear this out and pull it out and do it again. So I'm not sure whether the finished product is actually worse as a result. Especially as Microsoft now tells you how unintelligible you are and you've repeated this and it doesn't like that in terms of writing. I also work to deadlines too. If a publisher is after me, then I'll sort of sit there for 3 hours and then go in the garden for 3 hours and come back and do another 3 hours. Yes, yes, I need deadlines.
So you're not like Anthony Trollope, you don't ask your valet to wake you up at 4:30 in order to write for 3 hours before you go to the post office?
No, I enjoy mornings in bed, I'm afraid, yeah.
And That's what Samuel Johnson actually said. He said that I always recommend rising early to young people if they want to achieve anything, but I myself have been lying in bed till noon my whole life.
No, not till noon, but certainly.
Till noon is nice. Yeah, you need to talk into the microphone for the purposes of recording.
Yes, okay. Yes, no, I don't lie in bed till noon, but I don't usually start anything until 10 o'clock in the morning, no. But I might be still at it by midnight if it's particularly enthralling or if I'm late with it. But I'm trying to wind down now. It's, I think I'm in the danger of being accused of graphomania.
And about the second question, do you consider yourself more of a historian or a translator or literary critic and biographer?
Well, funny enough, when I first started writing about Chekhov and Mandelstam and literature as a whole, and then I switched to history, the professors of history in my college said, "You're not a historian." In other words, you have no right to write history unless you are already a historian.
Then how do you begin? You can't write history until you're a historian, but so how do historians become historians?
If you keep on doing it, you become a historian by apprenticeship rather than by qualification. And I'm not sure what particular qualities you need to be in order to be a historian. They imply that you need to be especially truthful, which is not true of literary critics and biographers. I'm not sure what, but I've noticed historians are particularly ill-tempered people.
Because they are dealing with a lot of horrendous stuff on a daily basis.
Well, not if you're a historian of England. I remember being told by one of the Toynbees that they weren't allowed to play as children with the children of other historians of the J.P. Taylors. Because they so disapproved of each other that they thought they couldn't possibly allow their children to play with with each other.
They certainly were passionate about their subject.
Well, if you read reviews by historians of other historians, you notice that they're pretty murderous. Yeah. But yeah.
Hi, Donald, Tom Duval. I very much look forward to reading the book. The Crimean Tatars ran, I think, what historically was the biggest slave trade of their era. Could you tell us a bit about how that came to be? Was this just a historical inheritance of, the Genghis Khan and the fact that there was plenty of slaves on the north side of the Black Sea and plenty of buyers on the south side? But that's quite an extraordinary story. Yes. Who were their slaves? How did it happen? Also, the Girays, it's an interesting story, almost a book in itself, that they left Crimea, a lot of them, and then some of them became Cherkess, some of them went to the Balkans, some of them went to Turkey, some of them in America. The Girays, the Sultan family of...
Oh, yes. Oh, the Girays, some in London.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, they spread all over the world. Yeah. Well, in terms of the slave trade, I don't think it's typical of Genghis Khan's hordes, because he was more interested in territory, and he didn't usually take prisoners. Genghis, I don't know if you've read Montaigne on what to do with prisoners. Montaigne felt that you should kill them, because by resisting and not surrendering, they were causing more bloodshed, and therefore they didn't deserve to live. And I think Genghis Khan had that principle. He went to a city, if it surrendered immediately, it was okay. And he might recruit soldiers from among them, but that was it. If they resisted, they were all killed. And I don't know of any Genghis Khan doing much in the way of slave trade. It seems to be a Crimean innovation. And the odd thing about Crimea, when they made war, they weren't really interested in acquiring territory. They acquire little bits of Circassia and occasionally a bit of steppe land, but they worked out it was so profitable, and the slaves were necessary because they were so busy in having cavalry that they had no time to cultivate the land. So you needed slaves to farm. And some of those slaves seem to have settled quite nicely and integrated, and Islam does recommend freeing slaves after 7 years, treating them as members of the household, not using physical punishment. That wasn't always observed, but generally speaking, that was a success. And then they marketed it, of course. They had Feodosia, Kaffa, was the biggest slave market in the Orient, and it came from all over the world. The Ottomans were very careful to enslave with limitations. They tended to take from Arabs, they tended to East Africans, not to offend the European powers by excessive slavery. They saw what happened to the Algerians, the Barbary pirates, who did slave Europeans, that they got wiped out as a result. And they were careful. Whereas the Tatars were just ruthless with Poland, particularly. In fact, one of the Polish bishops had to authorize the remarriage among his parishioners, even though they might have a spouse living as a slave in Crimea, because otherwise the population was going to die out. There was an interesting manual published in Istanbul in the 1560s, recommending slaves, saying Poles are good, Russians are terrible.
Why?
Unreliable. Hungarians are very able and skillful, but they're liable to kill you. And Circassians, of course, are prized above all because they were the most beautiful, and they were sent to usually to the harem of viziers and so on. So it was a big export market, and sometimes the price would drop if the Tatars came back with 100,000 slaves, and you could hardly sell them at the auction. But there were regular auctions, and Armenian Christians and Jews also bought slaves. So it was Georgians too. From the west of Georgia was virtually depopulated in the 17th century, when impoverished nobles would invite priests to a wedding and then shackle all the priests and sell them to the Turks or to the Tatars. It's estimated 2 million, so it's about the same as the number of Africans that Portugal shipped from Africa to Brazil. It's comparable, but it certainly was a major reason for resentment. And they also had a very elaborate method of dealing with prisoners of war. If they didn't enslave them, they had an intelligence service, which they sent spies into Austria and Hungary to look at the houses of the relatives of their prisoner of war to assess how much money they could afford to redeem their prisoner, and then the price would be set. So it was quite systematic. But it's a complex subject, but it was perhaps one of the biggest thorns in the flesh of their neighbors, was the ruthless slavery.
Yes, and the Girai is everywhere except Crimea.
Stephen DL. It's 2 comments rather than questions, if this is okay. Firstly, on the subject of unpleasant writers, I'm sure I was not the only one who was deeply disappointed last year to find out what an unpleasant person George Orwell was. The book,
Was he really?
He was very, very horrible to his wife.
He wrote such a nice text about English food.
Yeah, but he was...
Could he really have been a bad person?
There's a book was published last year which shows that he was really unpleasant to his wife. And had some rather nasty traits as well. So that was one thing. The other one about writing dictionaries. Back in the 1980s, I was a Soviet military analyst, and a friend of mine who was at the time a serving military officer had been tasked with creating a Russian-English military dictionary, which was then going to be classified as restricted. Not that there was any particular reason, because it was a dictionary, but he was tasked with doing this, and unfortunately, unlike your good self, Professor Rayfield, he found it rather tedious. And it was a Friday afternoon where he'd got to the word wimpel, which of course is, in a military sense, is a pennant or a banner, and feeling a bit hacked off, as you may be aware, the military tends to use the word kit a lot. So for Wimple, he just put down nun's kit, i.e. like a wimple, and rather forgot about it, and on the Monday got back to it. Anyway, a few years later, because it was restricted, so not many people saw this, and he thought, great. And a few years later, I was in a bookshop in Oxford with him, and the Ministry of Defence had decided to make some money from this by publishing it, de-restricting it, making it available for £25, late 1980s. So he and I looked at it, got it off the shelf, and all they'd done was take off the covers where it was restricted and put new covers on. So you could buy this dictionary for £25, and it still said that Wimple was nun's kit. So one still has to be careful, I think, even when making a dictionary.
Yes, you have to be careful. Well, we had a team of 6 people, and we kept each other in check, I think.
So I just want to ask, how do you see the future of tribes in the time of globalization? Future of tribes in the time of globalization. Of course, it's very nice, like on paper, preservation of culture and something like that. But being born, for example, in a small tribe, and then having a role like to learn this culture, and then to marry like local, and then to teach your children this culture, and then basically like preserve this culture. So it just in the time of globalization doesn't. Is it worth it? Is it like? Is there some kind of great meaning in this, or it just will be kind of outdated at some point?
So will smaller ethnicities survive in a globalizing environment where there's so much temptation to just learn English and have done with it?
Sorry, will what survive?
Will tribes, smaller ethnicities like the one you're writing about, or will they and their like be just swept away by globalization?
Well, all my experience suggests that things are being evened out and lost.
Please, you should talk.
Sorry, that globalization does obliterate quite a lot, and obliterate differences between different cultures. So yes, I imagine we're going to lose more than we're going to gain. Have I misunderstood your question?
No, I just let's say for how long will it survive then? So basically, is it worth it to preserve this culture, to preserve the tribes?
Oh, it's always worth it to keep on struggling.
But yeah. It's worth it from like global view, but on the local, personal, like if you are born in this tribe, then basically.
So yes, I understand perhaps what you're driving at. For a person, for their own personal development and perspectives, it's of course more advantageous to learn a global language and become part of the world than to put effort into preserving their own culture, which, as even you just have said, will not possibly survive globalization.
There are some advantages in not having a global language. There are some cultures that are being protected because their neighbors don't understand them. And they can't see what's going on. When I was writing a history of Georgia, I realized that was one of the secrets, that the Georgians could spy on their neighbors, but their neighbors couldn't spy on the Georgians. And even when Russia took over, it had problems. I worked in the Communist Party archives of the Georgians, and they were required to report to Moscow on certain things. You could see that what they reported in Russian was not the same as what they had in Georgian, and the Russians never were able to check up. Very few Russians ever bothered to learn a difficult language of one of their minorities. So in a sense, it's probably a good idea to keep up your own native language, make it a priority, and conceal your knowledge of the global language. As a form of protection against your oppressors.
So, do we have any more questions? Yes.
Hello. Sorry, I feel a bit sorry asking this question because I haven't read your book, and maybe if I do read it, I find the answer. I don't know. And it's a rather broad one, but you intrigued me when you said that, you seem to have some special insight that our history could have turned differently, and that the Crimean Tatars could have been kind of the sultans of a whole region instead of the Ottomans. I wonder, what insight do you have into that? And because you said it with such conviction, like you understand what would have happened then if it was the other way around. So I'm interested.
So are we talking about the Ukrainian?
Well, you said that the Crimean Tatars could
Yes,
have
yes.
been, yes,
It's a complicated,
kind of the heads of empire instead of the Ottomans, if I understood you correctly.
Yes, it's
And
a very
what would that have
complicated
given?
question. If you're Ukrainian, you know that Ukraine was various factions of Cossacks were sometimes in alliance with the Ottomans, sometimes against the Ottomans, sometimes in alliance with the Poles, sometimes against the Poles, and very often they banded together with the Tatars. Bogdan Khmelnytsky could speak perfect Crimean Tatar. He could even pray in Arabic and pretend to be a Muslim convert. And so for years they understood each other. And in the 19th century, it was Ukrainian poets who translated things from the Crimean Tatar when Russians were not in the least interested. So although there was a lot of fighting between Cossacks and Crimean Tatars over the centuries, and Cossacks fought each other, Zaporozhians fought Don Cossacks and so on, I think nowadays most Crimean Tatars regard Ukrainians as the nearest thing they have to a friend. More friendly, certainly, than the Turks at the other side of the Black Sea. Sorry, I misheard the question. Sorry?
So, if I understood the question correctly, it was about the possibility you mentioned of the Crimean Tatar dynasty heading the Ottoman Empire. So,
Yes.
the question was, what would have happened then?
Knowing the Ottoman Empire, I think there would have been riots and revolts against the Tatars running the country. And there were a number of Tatar Khans who were respected and listened to by sultans. 3 or 4 of them were regarded as equals in wisdom and reliability, but mostly they were not quite trusted. And I think if they'd been in charge and having dynastic control, there would have been a big problem. There were some major differences between the Tatars and the Ottoman Turks. The Crimean Tatars would never marry outside their own circle. They'd certainly never marry a Christian slave, as frequently Ottomans did. They were reluctant to marry someone who wasn't a member of their dynasty, in fact. They were a bit inbred. I think that would have excluded so many people. The Ottomans survived because they included a lot of Christians who may have converted, but Greeks, Albanians, Armenians, and so on.
Yes, Ottoman Empire was pretty inclusive.
It was, yes. Yes, one thinks, the solution to Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine would be to ask the Ottomans to come back and sort it.
Actually, there's a weird line of logic running through your narrative that when empires take over, things become peaceful.
Well, unfortunately, the Ottoman Empire is dead, so we can't do that.
Which empire is not dead at the moment? Which empire is alive at that moment? Whom can we ask to step up and, handle the mayhem?
It wouldn't be handled the same way.
So, sorry. Yeah. No good scenarios here.
Thank you very much for the fascinating conversation. And I think, given the discussion earlier about cultural preservation, linguistic preservation, and the profession of historian in general, I was wondering what you think about some of the technical developments we've been seeing. So the text editors were mentioned, of course, but I wonder if you think the role of technology in the future can play a role in preservation, archiving, maybe historical data processing, anything like that. Do you think that the profession of historian might be very different 10, 20, 50 years from now?
Yes. The material will be very different. So much exists electronically and is liable to disappear that sitting in archives digging out documents is going to be less possible. I don't know that the principles will change. It's just that the opportunities will decline in some ways. There'll be a mass of unreliable and sometimes material that is alterable. Particularly with AI, it's very hard to know what is genuine and what is not. So I think historians are going to have to develop techniques against deception and faking. So I think if you're a medieval historian, you're fine. But if you're dealing with modern history, you haven't.
I was fascinated by the project Vesuvius and its success, deciphering burned scrolls from the Pompeii with the help of artificial intelligence and all sorts of other new and unknowable technologies. They've actually found some fragments from Euripides' tragedy and the beginning of a philosophical work by one of the philosophers of the school of Epicurus, which has not surfaced for the last 2,000 years. So there may be new opportunities.
No, you're right in that way, that the techniques of reading what wasn't readable before and scripts that were not deciphered. And one recent example, which was successful, was the language of the of the Caucasian Albanians, who was a people living in what is today Azerbaijan, who had a language of their own, were Christians, and were thought to have lost everything. And then one day a wall in St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt collapsed and a whole lot of manuscripts fell down. And the monks said, "Oh no, not another Georgian Bible, please." And then they noticed that it was a palimpsest. The Georgian Bible had been written over something else, but they couldn't read it. And Volkswagen, who supported a lot of things, came along and said, "We have a new computer process which reads the molecules of certain inks, but not the molecules of other inks. And so you can put this manuscript there, it won't read what's on top, it'll read what's underneath." And what was underneath turned out to be ancient Caucasian Albanian from the 6th century, the whole book of John and several epistles, enough to create a grammar of the language. And then they discovered that, in fact, this language still existed, because there are 3 villages in the Caucasus, 2 in Azerbaijan, 1 in Georgia, where they speak what is called Udi. And Udi is a remarkable language because all its inflections are in the middle of the root, not at the beginning or at the end. They're not prefixes, they're not suffixes, they're infixes. Udi has been ignored largely because it's only spoken by a few hundred people. But suddenly Volkswagen came along, devoted an enormous amount of money, and the parents of the children in these villages were persuaded that their children should be taught to read and write Udi, and that they had an ancient Christian language, even though they were now Muslims. And so it all started, and that wouldn't have done without a very modern spectroscopy process. So you're right, there are things like that. In the Crimea, there are stone inscriptions that haven't been read, are thought to be in Gothic. And I imagine if anyone were interested there and had the technology, that too. So yes, there are things that modern science can do. For archaeology, I would say primarily.
I have a bit of personal question, because my father was born in the Crimea in 1939 in village Sheikh Mamai. While you work on this book, did you have your own suggestion why Stalin decided to deport Crimean Tatars, and not only Crimean Tatars, but a lot of other ethnicities. So why it was such a decision?
For the same reason that Catherine the Great took it. He thought Crimea was, from a military point of view, absolutely crucial, and it should only be populated by absolutely loyal people. In other words, the military and their families. So for the same reason that Catherine also expelled a great number of Tatars and brought in Christians, first of all, Greeks and Bulgarians, and later on these too were regarded as not sufficiently loyal. So, and the other thing is that Stalin, as a Georgian, had prejudices against North Caucasians, and he included the Tatars with the Circassians and the Abkhaz and the other, and the Karachay and the others that he deported. So it was sheer prejudice, and he accused them of collaboration with the Germans. But the evidence is there was collaboration, of course, and if you'd suffered under Stalin, of course you'd welcome Hitler. But it was no...
Russians collaborated with the Germans to a much larger extent than any other ethnicity in Soviet Union.
I'm not sure that's true. I think the evidence shows that there are 2,000 Tatars who fought for the Soviets as guerrillas, and there were 2,000 who actively fought for the Germans. The Germans then had two categories of what they called Hiwis, Hilfswilliger, people who were willing to work in Germany, and they went to Germany to work in factories. And then they had Schuma, which is Schutzmannschaft, which were workers, local policemen. And from all the evidence I've seen is that what the Tatars wanted was to be able to get on with their lives without being interfered with. They were lucky in having a Gauleiter called Frauenfeld, who came from Vienna, who happened to be liked by Hitler. And Frauenfeld persuaded Hitler that the best thing was to leave them in peace. The Jews among them were exterminated, but not the Karaim, who were the majority Jews, who were... Hitler was persuaded that Karaim in Lithuania and in the Crimea, because they only read the Pentateuch, were not proper Jews. Similarly, Georgian Jews managed to persuade the Germans that they weren't proper Jews, because most of them didn't know any Hebrew, and they also spoke Georgian. So the Crimeans had an easier life of it with Frauenfeld, until the SS got in towards the end, and then, of course, they had a tough life. But I think there was collaboration, certainly. There was a famous incident when Soviets sent a parachute descent, and the Tatars decided that they had to report it to the Germans, because if they didn't, the Germans would come anyway, and they'd all be killed. So that was something that caused a great deal of indignation among Russians. But if you look at the rest of the Ukraine, I don't think the collaboration was any greater in the Crimea. And given what they'd been through under Stalin, I think any normal person couldn't have believed at first that Hitler would be worse. Hitler did have these plans for making Crimea a special province, because he was persuaded they were actually Goths, and therefore they were even more Aryan than he was. It was going to be Gotenland, and it was going to be Theodor de Rixhafen, Sevastopol. So there were Germans in their foreign office and the Canaris and so, who were very pro-Turkic and very pro this idea of being friendly to Muslims in the Russian period. They didn't always have their way. In the novel I've just translated by a Crimean Tatars novelist, there's an enormous problem when the Germans decided that anyone who was circumcised was a Jew and therefore to be shot. And it took some persuasion that this would mean shooting all the Muslims as well. So they had problems. But Stalin had this obsession with treacherous Muslims. He left it to Beria to do the appalling, dirty work. But similar things happened to other nations as well. It's just in the case of Crimea, what is striking is that all the other deported nations were allowed back, even when the territory being given to another nation like Chechnya and Ingushetia were given to Georgia for a while. But the Crimean Tatars sent delegations to Moscow saying, why can't we go back, after the Khrushchev's speech, which he admitted there was a crime. And the reason was that Crimea had been settled by Russian officers and their wives and their children and families, and they didn't want the Tatars back. And so they made an exception, and they made this allegation of exceptional collaboration with the enemy, which I think was exaggerated and in some ways totally untrue. So that is a tragedy. On the other hand, people who were in exile sometimes developed enormously, and the Tatars in Uzbekistan became extraordinary. Some of them became very rich, builders, mechanics, musicians particularly. And when they came back, they were able to, in a few years, to really establish themselves in Simferopol University, television station, publishing house. It's extraordinary what they managed to do in 10 years. The same applies to the Koreans who were deported to Kazakhstan. They became the mainstay. Or the Germans in Almaty from the Volga, who converted a lot of Kazakhs to Lutheranism and started developing the fruit industry. But no, it was a terrible tragedy, but they could have recovered if they'd been allowed to stay in Crimea when they got back.
So, we now have to thank our audience for their attention and their highly intelligent questions, and conclude our session. Thank you very much indeed for this conversation. I enjoyed it very much. I had an opportunity to ask questions that particularly interest me. Whether they are of any interest to anybody else is another question, but that's the privilege of, being part of a conversation, and I exploited this privilege for all it was worth. So thank you very much indeed for this opportunity, and thanks to Pushkin House for hosting this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donald. Thank you so much for this illuminating talk and for touching on such a broad diversity of themes. And I would just like to say, as I said, this was the last event in the series of shortlisted book prize events. But we also have 2 more events coming associated with the book prize, which is going to be a talk by Yelena Kostyuchenko, a former last year's winner of the book prize, talking about independent journalism. And also Polina Barskova, one of the members of the jury, as is Yelena Kostyuchenko this year, will also be presenting her new book in Russian on Saturday. So please do come and check out our website. Thank you again for this wonderful conversation. Thank you.